Thank you for joining us for this JINSA policy webinar. We are honored to have joining us today Alan Makovsky, JINSA Gamunder Center Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project Member, Svante Cornell, JINSA Gamunder Center Advisor and Eastern Med Policy Project Member. This call will be moderated by Jonathan Ruhe, JINSA Director of Foreign Policy. They will be discussing our recently released report, Reshaped After the Pandemic, Turkish Aggression in the Eastern Mediterranean. This report was made possible by the Gettler Family Foundation. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on the screen, or you can also ask questions by raising your hand in the Zoom hand feature. For those in the audience, you're automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Jonathan to start this discussion.
Thank you very much, Harris, and thank you all for joining our call today. As Harris mentioned, this is the latest report from our Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project, a project we started about a year ago to examine what we think is an underappreciated area of growing strategic importance for the United States, both given Turkey's policy in the region, but also the growing opportunities that come from energy development and other areas. And so in the past year, this is now our fourth report we've released. If people are interested in the pace with which current events are moving in the region, I highly recommend our report that just came out, and also the one we released in May that looks at Turkey's intervention in Libya and the consequences for regional stability of that decision by Turkey. So the title of our new report comes from a quote from Turkey's President Erdogan from earlier this summer. It says, "Turkey will be one of the outstanding countries in the world that will be reshaped after the pandemic." Our report looks at the implications of COVID-19 for the Eastern Mediterranean and how Turkish actions have been affected by COVID and also taken advantage of the changes and upheaval brought by the pandemic. So with this framing device, let's jump right into some questions. Alan, my first question is for you. And so just today, we noticed there was a potential agreement between the Greeks and the Egyptians to delineate their offshore exclusive economic zones, as they're called. We also seem to note in our report that Turkey is increasingly isolated amid this growing clamor for energy in the region. And I was wondering if you could explain for our audience, why is Ankara essentially the odd man out in the region here in terms of delineating energy exploration?
Well, actually, I think it's a mix of three interrelated reasons having to do with geography, geopolitics, and the personal leadership style of President Erdogan. Regarding geography, it's just a reality that in Turkey's natural EEZ, as you said, economic exclusion zone, the area where a state has a right beyond its territorial seas to exploit natural resources. By its natural EEZ, as recognized by the law of the sea, Turkey doesn't have any oil or gas. So that's just a reality. I should point out that Turkey does not recognize the law of the sea. It has not ratified it, neither has the United States, neither has Israel, but, and some other countries, but the United States and Israel do accept the rules of the law of the sea, the application of it. Turkey complains. They say, hey, it's not fair. We have the longest coast, Mediterranean coast in the region. How can we be shut out of all the energy projects? And I think, okay, you can kind of understand the life is unfair attitude but it really amounts to a pout. I mean, there's nothing written in the law of the sea or the Quran that Turkey has to have access to hydrocarbons just because it has a long Mediterranean coast. As for geopolitics, I think we also have to look at the Cyprus problem. Turkey does not recognize the Republic of Cyprus, which is the Greek Cypriot dominated government located in the south, the southern 2/3 of the island, which is recognized by the entire world except Turkey. Turkey occupies the northern third of the island and recognizes a Turkish Cypriot government. If Turkey were to recognize the Republic of Cyprus, there's no doubt it would be part of the energy game. Israel would have loved to have piped its gas to Turkey. It's the shortest route. Cyprus, as a matter of fact, would be delighted to pipe its gas to Turkey. It's a very short route, and Turkey could then distribute it to Europe. But because of Turkey's non-recognition of the Republic of Cyprus, none of those things can happen. So that's another reason for its isolation. And then, of course, thirdly, there's the Erdogan factor. Turkey, through Erdogan's policies and Erdogan's rhetoric, has aroused the enmity of many states in the region. I mean, we know he is constantly going after Israel, even just the other day, after converting Hagia Sophia into a mosque. He said that this will be a springboard to the liberation of Jerusalem. He's constantly criticizing Israel. And of course, we know there was the famous Mavi Marmara incident in 2010, and things have never really normalized since then, although there was a brief period that they called normalization. He's also at odds with Egypt. Sisi overthrew a Muslim Brotherhood government that Erdogan favored. And in general, Erdogan is paranoid about military coups, as we know. So that was another reason for his enmity to Sisi in Egypt. He's at loggerheads with the UAE, which is not Eastern Med, but is involved in Eastern Med activities in Libya, with Saudi Arabia. And of course, there's long-standing problems with Greece and Cyprus. And so I think the regional states have no desire to be generous with Erdogan. In fact, I would say that their concern about Turkey under Erdogan is cementing working partnerships in the region among a bunch of states that maybe wouldn't be quite so close otherwise. And we kind of see a team forming of states in the region that have problems with Turkey, and it's a variegated team. It's Israel and Greece and Cyprus and Egypt and Jordan and Saudi and UAE and France. So, I think for all of those reasons, just to recapitulate, geography, geopolitics, and leadership personality, that's why Turkey's isolated.
Thank you, Alan, for that frankly fascinating answer. Svante, I'd like you to build on that, expand on it just a little bit. One thing that we note in our task force in our reports is the role of ideology in terms of Turkish foreign policy making, and as Alan mentioned, contributing to its isolation in the region. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the ideological angle to Turkey's policy around the region, and perhaps the effects that's having on the rest of the states in the region?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Alan, for your very comments, which I completely agree with. I think to understand the ideological aspect of Turkey's behavior, we have to go back almost a decade to the Arab upheavals that some people call the Arab Spring, in which Turkey and Turkish leaders really saw as an opportunity to establish Turkey's role as a dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean and the North Africa and the Middle East, actually. Managing change in the Middle East is the way the Turkish leadership use, is a term they use to explain their aspirations. It sounded far-fetched at the time, but it was very much grounded in their idea that the regimes of the Middle East were all authoritarian monarchies in one way or another, and they included in that definition the regimes of those like in Egypt. And the moment they would fall, the political Islam modeled on the Muslim Brotherhood of the same type of ideology that Turkey itself follows would take over. And essentially, Turkey and Erdogan would be the leader of this new emerging Muslim Brotherhood arc across the region. And that's why, as Alan mentioned, Turkey supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, then they supported it in Egypt, and so on. Now, as we all know, this policy failed disastrously. And as it failed, and Turkey really had its relationships with most of the countries, if not all of the countries in the neighborhood, deteriorated, they found themselves very isolated. You would have thought that Erdogan drew some lessons from that or some conclusions and changed his policies, but in fact, they really doubled down on this attitude. I'm sorry. They doubled down on this attitude, and the only place where they really found a place to redeem themselves was in Libya. In Libya, they figured that supporting the Muslim Brotherhood-aligned government there against the same forces that had thwarted Turkey's attempted, rise in other parts of the Middle East would be a way of restoring or putting Turkey back on the path of greatness that Erdogan has been aiming for since day one. And I think that's how we have to understand the general attitude of Erdogan across the Eastern Mediterranean, but particularly in Libya.
Thank you, Svante. Before I proceed to the next question, Harris, would you like to remind our listeners very quickly just how they can ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. They can write it in the Q&A box and I'll ask the question on their behalf, or they can raise their hand and they can ask the question directly to you. Again, Q&A box and I'll ask the question, or raise their hand and they can do it directly.
Okay, thank you. So Alan, I know we've been focused on specifically on Turkey for the first couple of questions here, but what sort of transformations are Turkey's actions having on other countries in the region? Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, Libya, Israel, sort of any of the above. How are they responding or adapting to Turkish policy?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I think it is having a bonding effect in the region as there forms a group of countries that are significantly supportive of one another because of concern about Turkey. On the one hand, you have the triangles that the two Hellenic countries, Greece and Cyprus, have formed with Israel and with Egypt. Now, I think that Israel's motive was not necessarily anti-Turkish. Once Israel had a falling out with Turkey, it was looking for other friends. And I think Israel is usually pretty careful to make clear that they are not looking to confront Turkey. Nevertheless, Israel has taken to calling its relations with Cyprus and Greece an alliance, even though they say it's not a military alliance. But the use of the term alliance is no doubt, we know it's provocative for Turkey, and the Israelis no doubt know that. And there is certainly a security dimension. There have been joint exercises between Israel and Greece and Israel and Cyprus. We've also seen the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, both of whom, as Svante detailed so well, are concerned about Erdogan pushing a Muslim Brotherhood line. We've seen them open up to Cyprus and Greece in a way they haven't before. As a matter of fact, the Saudi foreign minister is in Cyprus today. Cairo started the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which includes most of the states that I've mentioned. France is not part of it, but they've applied for membership. Turkey is not formally excluded from it, but they want Turkey to to accept the rules of the game, which Turkey doesn't. Their rules of the game, which Turkey doesn't seem inclined to do. So there are a number of things going on. Also in January and again in May, a number of countries met, I think the second time only virtually, the first time in Egypt, to condemn Turkish actions in Libya. Israel was not present at that. The Israelis say they weren't invited actually, but but France was, and of course Greece, Cyprus, UAE, I believe Saudi as well. So there's a number of things going on. That said, I do want to make clear, I don't think any of this amounts to an actual military alliance. And for now, if Turkey were to attack any of the countries that I mentioned, there's no guarantee that they would not be on their own. So there is a bonding, but it hasn't bonded into a military alliance at this point.
That's a very interesting point. We'll jump back to perhaps some military aspects of regional developments in a second. Svante, my next question is for you, and I understand you may have to jump lines halfway through, so we'll ask Alan to jump in at that point. But Svante, I was wondering if you could give our listeners just a general sense of what the impact of COVID-19 has actually been on Turkey and also on energy development in the region.
Well, I think everything is relative. So whereas Turkey has been affected by the COVID pandemic, I think from a Turkish perspective, they feel that they have been able to ride this out much better than the United States and the European countries. All across the region, I mean, countries like Greece have probably even handled it better than Turkey has. But I think in the bigger picture, Turkey sees a situation, I think, in a way similar to the financial crisis a decade or more or so, where they felt that, the West is distracted. And if you are at the moment to advance unilaterally and make moves and create new facts on the ground or facts in the sea, if you will, is now. I think that's what led in part to the Turkish move in the Middle East back a decade ago after the Arab upheaval. And I think similarly now they feel, especially in the energy sector, that the oil companies are pulling back or suspending activity. The United States is distracted both by the election and the pandemic, the Europeans similarly, and this is a time for them who don't really have to deal with the same type of internal opinion and internal dissent to act decisively, very much in a similar way to what we've seen the Chinese do in this period. And I think that's an effect of the fact that they feel that they have the pandemic under control. I'm calling from Sweden right now, and Turkey has a population 10 times of Sweden almost, and they have the same number of deaths. So it's a younger population, and they don't have a lot of old people in nursing homes. People tend to care for their old people at home, and that's helped them limit the effect of the pandemic, maybe because of pure luck or the demographic status, but the result is that they feel that they're in a better position and they're ready to move ahead on geostrategic matters that they can continue to be focused on, at least the leadership, whereas, of course, both in the U.S. and Europe, everybody is distracted from geostrategic affairs.
Alan, I'd like to ask if you have any follow-on thoughts, but then also to expand that a little bit. We go into our report looking at, as Svante sort of alluded to, Turkey's sort of fraught economic situation. So I'd like to ask you first if you have any additional comments on what you see as the impact of the pandemic on Turkey or the region, but also what you see Turkey's economic outlook looking like, and where that may drive Erdogan.
Yeah. Look, I think Svante actually covered it very well. I mean, COVID basically intensifies dynamics that were largely already in play, including, it seems to me the U.S. is increasing remoteness from the region, leaving a gap that Turkey, among others, has been filling. So I think that is regarding COVID. I would say, though, as you so aptly raised, the economy of COVID is no blessing for Turkey. I mean, even geopolitically, because it is exacerbating Turkey's economic problems. And this very day, Turkey's Lira dropped to the lowest level in its history since it resuscitated its currency, established a new currency in the early part of this century. I think it was in 2003. It dropped to over 7 liras. I think it actually got to 7.21 and may have gained back a bit, but still is over 7 liras, which Erdogan sees as a magic number. He spent tens of billions of dollars trying to keep it below that level. Now, I don't know if that sounds like an abstruse indicator to people, but for people who've lived in Turkey, you know that nothing, the Turks focus on no economic statistic more than what the exchange rate is with the dollar. Even inflation figures, unemployment, when the lira is dropping against the dollar, people start to panic. And of course, that applies to foreign investors as well. So I think Turkey is facing a lot of economic problems. Its unemployment is in, as stated by its own statistical bureau, is in the high single digits at this point. It came down a bit, but before COVID, I guess it's back to around 11%. Youth unemployment is roughly 25%. And of course, the tourists aren't coming like they used to. That's an important part of the Turkish economy. So I think it's rough times ahead. It makes it more challenging for Turkey to sustain its foreign adventures, but B, in some ways, it makes those foreign adventures more necessary because politically, because as the economy stumbles, people grow more disgruntled with Erdogan's government, and he needs foreign adventures to help perk up his popularity. By the way, these foreign adventures tend to help a bit, but their effect tends to be short-lived. But nevertheless, Erdogan keeps going that route. And, you know, I would say if there were a free and fair election today in Turkey, it's very touch and go whether Erdogan could win. I mean, both of the presidential elections he's won in the past have been by just under and just over 52%. And the polls show him slipping. So, you know, he doesn't have the economy, which was his savior for many years. In the early AKP years, they did fantastically well with the economy, but it's now been plateaued for about a decade and now getting worse. And that's no doubt feeding his desire for foreign adventures like we've seen in Syria and Libya and Iraq.
And it's sort of, I'll pose this question first to you, Alan, but then to Svante. One of sort of a place Erdogan has butted heads is with a fellow NATO ally, with France, who's, as Alan, as you mentioned, is becoming increasingly involved in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we can start here and then open the aperture a little bit wider to look at U.S. policy more generally. But is there, do you see much of a U.S. policy toward Turkey, toward all the things Erdogan's been doing that we've been discussing? Is it a policy? Are there policies? Is it a vacuum? Where does the U.S. find itself?
Yeah. Yeah, policies is probably a good way to put it. That does tend to happen in our government anyway, because Congress sometimes has a mind of its own, but as it certainly does regarding Turkey. But I would say a foreign policy has rarely been as bifurcated between the president and the rest of the bureaucracy as I think our current policy towards Turkey is. I mean, Trump has, for whatever reason, people can speculate, Trump is very enamored of Erdogan. They have a close relationship. Trump has basically refused to put the sanctions on Turkey that were supposed to come into play according to congressional law. Once Turkey purchased the S-400 from Russia, Trump has just ignored that. There was a court case against Halkbank, which was involved in sanction circumvention with Iran a few years back. It should have led to a major fine from OFAC, from the Treasury Department. It was widely expected to happen. I mean, in Washington circles about a year ago, people were speculating on what month the OFAC sanctions would come down. They've never happened. You know, it's clear that Trump is a friend to Erdogan and doesn't want to sanction him. Now, that said, there is a certain irony. 2 times, Trump has briefly put sanctions on Turkey, once regarding the Pastor Brunson incident, which hit home to Trump's political base here in the United States. And of course, also briefly last October after Turkey invaded northeastern Syria. Apparently, despite US wishes, although it did seem that Trump greenlighted the invasion at the last minute. Once Turkey agreed to limit the scope of that invasion, Trump lifted those sanctions. So Trump's a little unpredictable, but basically he's been a friend. And I think there's a lot of murkiness about where US policy is on Turkey. And even as we see in Libya, the US has, look, when Turkey made its deal with Libya in November, which established an EEZ, kind of a far-fetched and widespread EEZ where Libya's EEZ and Turkey's EEZ would border one another. The US did oppose that, come out against that. On the other hand, the other part of that agreement, which allowed Turkey to come in and support the GNA, the US took a basically hands-off to positive view because they saw it as being a counterweight to the Russian influence on Haftar. So it's been a pretty confused policy, I think, from the US standpoint.
Thank you for that, Alan. Svante is connecting. Harris, while Svante is connecting, do we have any questions queued up?
Yes, we do.
Hello?
Oh. Do you want to go with Svante, or do you want me to?
Yeah, Svante, it's very quick. Is there anything you'd like to add to Alan's comment about US policy or lack thereof?
I think there is a brief thing I would like to say, which is that it seems to me that in the US establishment, defense establishment, State Department, there is a fear of losing Turkey, which is, of course, a discussion that's been going on in Washington for a very long time. But at this point, I think, for example, we see in US policy in Libya that there is a tendency to think that the biggest danger there is Russia and Russia moving in. And that if the US were to break its relationship with Turkey through the sanctions, for example, that we would basically be risking handing Turkey over to the Russians, so to speak. And I think there's a lot of people who think that, you know, we can somehow work with the Turks. We can hope that things get better somehow, maybe by Erdogan leaving the scene or Erdogan changing his mind or something. Or in fact, I think most people probably don't even have a long-term vision for what might change, but that the downsides of breaking with Turkey are more dangerous than trying to somehow keep a working relationship with Erdogan, because there are so many issues in which Turkey is, of course, a key geopolitical actor. And I think that's why you see this bifurcation in the US government by people who I think are joining this call. Most of the people would think that Turkey's actions have to be met with action, whereas there are others who are trying to finesse it in a way. And I think that's still where we are today, where there is no real decision made how to handle Turkey.
Thank you for that. Harris, yes, audience Q&A.
Great. We have a call from Charlie Perkins, who's on the JINSA staff.
Gentlemen, hello. That's a really hello, everyone. Really a terrific and very insightful and timely briefing. All of you track Turkey more closely than I, but in terms of military readiness and capabilities, as far as the COVID epidemic has been transpiring in that area, have you seen, and I realize you touched on this a little bit, any direct impacts on the Turkish armed forces? Obviously, it's hit Turkey relatively hard, but not as hard as other countries. And Turkey has been able to cooperate with NATO in some response areas. But it certainly seems as if the Turkish military, whether it's the disruptive exercises in the Eastern Med that you've been discussing, or ongoing operations in northern Syria, or even I've noted in recent days, the Turkish military have been able to conduct some very robust joint exercises in the Western province in Azerbaijan, paradoxically an ally of Israel and the United States. But nevertheless, they seem to be proceeding without much hindrance, whereas it could be without. This is something all militaries are trying to figure out. How do you maintain your readiness in view of you can't obviously have social distancing in many military situations. How is the Turkish military been impacted by this, by the pandemic?
Alan, do you have? I don't really have anything to add on this point. Alan, do you have any?
I really don't, Charlie. I suspect you know better than either of us. I did see one report about 7 Turkish soldiers who contracted COVID, who were based in Syria. But by and large, I have to say that Turkey seems to be conducting its foreign policy and military policy, as if there were no COVID. So I'm not aware of any direct impact. I mean, this is not exactly your question, or not at all your question, but in terms of surprise, look, I think that after the coup attempt in July 2016, when the army was, and the military in general, particularly the Air Force, was so heavily purged, people thought that the Turkish military would be hobbled for quite a while. So I think looking at it from that perspective, I think it's been surprising that in fact Turkey over the past 4 years has been pursuing its most aggressive and far-flung policy ever. So that's certainly been a surprise. And it looked to me, as a non-military person who's watched Turkey for a long time, I've been struck that Turkey's military industrial complex has really begun to emerge. For so long. Look, I'm speaking from the perspective of decades, but till not very long ago, Turkey was very hat in hand regarding military equipment. They relied totally on foreign equipment. Now they're producing more and more of their own, including naval equipment, and of course, their armed drones, which are becoming more powerful and more accurate, and which they're using to particular effect these days in Iraq. And they also use them to major effect in Libya. So I apologize if that's not directly speaking to your question. Maybe you could answer the question for us, Charlie.
It has been interesting, Alan, sort of your point, when Turkey intervened in Libya earlier this year, how quickly it seemed Turkey's military changed facts on the ground and turned the tide in what had been a stalemated battlefront at that point. Harris, do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, we do. We have a written question, and I'm reading it as we speak. Do we have any clarity yet as to who was behind the coup? Do you want to answer that question, or?
Oh, sure. I could give it a crack. I think Alan and I can speak at length about this, perhaps for another webinar. Yeah. But I think the general view, which I hope Alan would share, because if he doesn't, it means I'm wrong, is that the coup was led by the Fethullah Gulen followers in the military and in the government, but it was not an exclusively Fethullah Gulen coup. It was a series of events in which I think a lot of people in the military were facing a binary choice between two forces that they did not necessarily like, either Erdogan or Gulen, this intra-Islamist, if you will, civil war within the Turkish state. And people sometimes, through a very planned thought process and sometimes very impulsively on the night of the coup, chose a side. I think we also need to keep in mind that it was more complicated than that, in the sense that there's clear evidence that Erdogan provoked some of the coup makers into action that they probably hadn't planned to engage in, for example, by threatening to purge all supposed Gulenists out of the military. But that's my short answer, Alan. You could probably elaborate much more.
Yeah, I mean, I largely recapitulated. I see it very similarly. I think the consensus is that it was a coalition of Gulenists, Kemalists, and careerists who were afraid they were about to be rotated out. The coup happened in mid-July, and the rotation was due to happen, the annual rotation, scheduled rotation, was due to happen at the end of July. I'm a little less convinced, perhaps, than Svante, because so much of it is obscure and so much of it is based on testimony of people who have bruises on their bodies. I mean, by which I mean, I don't know how much we can always believe the testimony. But I think there is a lot of Gulenist testimony that I've seen in rich detail. I think it's almost incontrovertible that Gulenists were involved. So I don't think we're ever going to fully know the truth. There are many mysteries, and I'll just mention what to me is one of the biggest, the chief of staff, Hulusi Akar. You would think he would have been the first guy to get let go. You know, either you would think this man was part of the coup, which is possible, or he was completely incompetent because the coup was hatched in his building. Yet somehow he emerges, he stays chief of staff, and then emerges as defense minister and one of Erdogan's most prominent advisors. So, you know, I think there's a lot of mystery still, and I think most of them we won't know the answer to.
Jonathan, we have. Oh.
Yes, please, Harris, go ahead.
We have another question. It's good afternoon. How do federal level sanctions affect business deals that individual states or U.S. businesses can have with Turkey? Isn't it hard to enforce economic sanctions without cooperation of every entity involved?
Would either of you like to take a stab at that?
Could you either repeat it? Or,
sure.
Yeah.
How do federal level sanctions affect business deals that individual states or U.S. businesses can have with Turkey? Isn't it hard to enforce economic sanctions without cooperation of every entity involved?
Well, right now we don't have any sanctions on Turkey. But I guess the questioner is thinking in terms of what if CATSA is applied. From my days when I worked in Congress as a staffer on Iran sanctions, we did have to have special cutouts and special provisions of the bill to make sure that it applied to states as well. So I think there are legal means of doing that, and I'm pretty sure the CATSA legislation takes care of that were CATSA sanctions to be invoked.
Jonathan, do you want me to continue with the questions? We have a couple more.
I don't know, Svante, do you want to add to that, or?
No, I couldn't add anything.
Okay.
Okay.
Harris, please.
I hope that addresses the questioner's issue.
I'll let you, if they respond to me, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Is Israel still servicing Turkey's drones?
Not to my knowledge. To my knowledge, there has not been any military relationship I think there were a few vestiges at the time of Mavi Marmara, and they were ended shortly thereafter. But really, since I think 2008, all major Israeli involvement with Turkish military deals had come to an end, or ended by Turkey. That's my
yeah, I agree. I think, I don't remember the year, but there was a time shortly after the Mavi Marmara, around 2010, 11 maybe, when the Turks actually started shifting their technology so that they did no longer designated Israeli airplanes and other Israeli equipment as friendly. And I think that was one of the steps in which you saw the total cut of all military cooperation, including, of course, Turkey canceling military exercises, NATO exercises that Israel had been invited to. Yeah. So there is, as far as I know, nothing going on. And in fact, Turkey, as Alan mentioned, is developing its own drone program. And I would think, I don't know how much of Israeli stuff they've stolen, if you will, intellectual property, but somebody else might know that.
Yeah. I think it is striking that Turkish policy, in my humble non-military expert opinion, seems so often to go against the grain of true Turkish national interests. I think the ending of the relationship with Israel is one example of that. I think a certain compatibility about the region, worldview about the region, really fed this cooperation, military cooperation between Turkey and Israel that started in the 90s, in the pre-Erdogan era. You look at the S-400 deal, which has caused the United States to refused to sell Turkey the 100 F-35 fighter aircraft that Turkey had contracted for, and to pull Turkey out of the joint production program, although that was supposed to happen in February. According to latest reports, Turkey is actually still participating in that program. But certainly if there's some talk of Congress pulling the plug on that, and once that happens, it's certainly not in Turkey's interest to be removed from a program that is producing the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. But nevertheless, Turkey is.
Just a quick 2 seconds. I think Alan's point is right on that. And Azerbaijan is a very good example of that. Azerbaijan tagged on to the Turkish-Israeli relationship back in the 90s and 2000s. And because the Azerbaijanis are not, motivated by ideology, and in fact only by pure national interest, they have kept intensifying their relationship with Israel ever more with every year that passes, in spite of Turkish objections. And Turkey is, of course, their major outside supporter, and that tells you just how much the relationship with Israel would make sense for both of those countries. But because of Erdogan and Turkey's other ambitions, I guess that's history now.
Harris, do we have any further questions from the audience?
Yeah, and by the way, Alan, yes, you did answer the question about the sanctions to the level that the questioner asked. This is another sanction-related question, and I don't know if you answered in your previous one, but it's related to Halk Bank and skirting the U.S. Iranian sanctions. Is there any status update you can give on that?
Look, there are two cases. There was the case against the Halk Bank official, which has taken place already, and he served his time, and actually, as a sort of thumb in the eye to the United States, I suppose, when he got back to Turkey, Erdogan appointed him as president of the stock exchange. But his conviction 2 years ago is what led to expectations that OFAC was going to fine Halk Bank. And that's what I made reference to earlier. There is a separate case being brought by SDNY, Southern District of New York, specifically against Halkbank institutionally for circumvention of sanctions. And last I heard, initially Halkbank said it wouldn't engage, but then they said they would. And last I heard, the opening of that trial was postponed because of COVID. And, you know, I'm not sure. I think it's supposed to start in the fall. Svante, do you know? Or anyone?
I haven't followed the latest update on that.
Yeah, I think it has not begun yet. It's supposed to start in the fall. But yes, that's the court case going forward. And, you know, it's significant not only for the symbolism of one bank. I mean, this is a state-owned bank. It's one of 3 state-owned banks. And there is a feeling that among many, that if it were fined to the extent that it actually circumvented sanctions, helped Iran circumvent sanctions, which people estimate to be in the 20 to 30 billion range, that it would actually cause the bank to collapse and would have a very serious impact on the entire Turkish banking system. So, you know, just to be clear, this is not just, you know, one little punishment to be meted out against one little bank. This is a linchpin bank, and you know, this judicial action is going to be worth watching very closely. And of course, you know, we have a presidential election coming up in November, as I think everyone on this call may have heard. And you know, were Trump not to be reelected, you know, I think there's certainly a very strong chance that some of the sanctions which could be legitimately imposed on Turkey now, but have not been by President Trump, could very well be by President Biden. Now, Biden is a cautious guy, and you know, I don't expect him to go crazy, but if you want to see his basic attitude about Turkey, look up his interview in the New York Times from January when they were interviewing all the candidates. He has some very choice things to say about Erdogan. So, so, you know, were he to be elected, I think, you know, our conversation today might, on some of these points like sanctions, might be very different.
Jonathan, do you have any closing line of questioning?
No, if Harris, if we don't have any more questions from the audience, and if there's anything else our panelists would like to say as a closing remark, yes, Alan.
Yeah, unless Svante wanted to go first. I've been doing a lot of it.
No, you go ahead, Alan. I'll follow.
Okay, I want to be fair, and I think all of us, when we write these reports, we try to be as analytic as possible. And so I do want to say, regarding Turkey's Libya policy, as upsetting as it is to many states in the region, and you know, as upsetting as it is, frankly, to a lot of U.S. allies, it has been a relatively successful policy, in my view, to this point. First of all, it came out of the blue. Nobody expected it. The Turks, whose theory about how vast their EEZ should be, seemingly had no takers in the world. Suddenly they found one in Libya, and it so happens, whether should be the case or not, but that government in Libya is the internationally recognized government. So it sort of gave a little bit of legitimacy, I think, from the Turkish point of view. It certainly scrambled things enough that I think it puts the East Med pipeline in doubt, because generally people don't like to invest in energy projects where territory is disputed. And I think also it sent a message to the region that Turkey can project power in a way that it historically has never been able to, and that's a source of concern for everybody. But from Erdogan's point of view, that's a positive. Final returns aren't in. Turkey still could stumble. They might get into a clash with Russia over Siirt. We don't know. that would be a big blunder. But to this point, from Erdogan's point of looking at it through a Turkish lens, I think you'd have to say it's been a successful policy.
Well, Alan mentioned projecting power. I think that's the key thing. We're not talking about a region all the way from North Africa all the way to, I guess the Sea of Japan, where the 25 years ago we thought we were entering a new world order in which everything was guided by laws and norms and agreements and international organizations led by the United States would, so to speak, mediate this new world order. Well, we're now in a different situation where I think, and coming from somebody like me who spends a lot of time in Central Asia, surrounded by all these great powers, they feel that they're much more vulnerable than ever because the great powers they are not constrained anymore. We see this, of course, with Russia and their behavior in Georgia, Ukraine, and their interference in Western democracies. We see China's new approach. We see India taking on a new role and, basically nullifying the autonomy of Kashmir, which is a long-standing dispute and something that they no earlier Indian government would have dared to do. Iran extending its sphere of influence from the Mediterranean to Yemen, and Turkey, which used to be, a country that was solidly in the Western camp, cooperating with the United States, upholding this system of norm-based international system, if you will. They're not anymore. They're part of the, if you will, they're a revisionist power that are trying unilaterally through a hodgepodge of short-term or long-term alignments with smaller countries like Qatar, regimes like the one in Syria, militias, or in Libya, militias in Syria and elsewhere, to try to project power in a way that I think is totally novel for them. But they've seen what other great powers have done, and they're saying, why not us? If rules don't apply anymore to those powers, why should it apply to us? And by the way, we're getting away with it. And I think gradually, I remember, little things like a number of years ago when Turkey Erdogan personally threatened to throw out the US ambassador during the Obama era. And this was met by a non-response. There was no implication, there was no consequence for threatening to throw out a US ambassador. And I think Erdogan has come to conclude, rightly so in my opinion, that he can challenge the Europeans, especially using the refugee issue. He can challenge the United States on Turkey's geostrategic importance and basically look and say, do you want to lose us? And I think the Western powers have decided more or less, and we see this in the EU last summit only days ago, they don't want to lose Turkey. They cannot afford to lose Turkey. And Erdogan has always been of the belief that the West needs Turkey more than Turkey needs the West. I happen to believe that's not true. But Erdogan is making it true only because the West is so poor at using its potential leverage and getting its act together. And I think as we go forward, we're only going to see this intensify, certainly as long as Erdogan is in power, but probably even after he's gone. Turkey, it's not your grandfather's Turkey, so to speak. This is a country that believes in itself, that has an immense resurgence of nationalism, which Erdogan has followed, by the way. It's not something, he's not in himself a nationalist. He is an Islamist, and that's very different in the Turkish context, but he's gravitated towards the nationalist in the state and in the political system. And he's surfing that wave, if you will, and that's going to continue after Erdogan.
Thank you both for those very insightful closing comments in addition to our entire discussion. I will say both Alan and Svante did an excellent job of plugging our task force's work. If you're interested in or intrigued by Alan's closing comments, please go to the JINSA website and see our report from May about Turkey's intervention in Libya and the implications for that. And if you're intrigued by what Svante had to say just now, keep your eyes peeled. We will be issuing further reports from this task force in the fall. But I'd like to thank Alan and Svante for joining us on this call day, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. And Harris, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Jonathan. I would like to thank you as well, Alan and Svante, those who called in. I'd also want to once again thank the Gettler Foundation for supporting our work here today, as well as the reports that these fine gentlemen are writing. And I want to reiterate, by the way, Svante called in from Sweden, so that's why it's probably a little darker in his background than Alan's background. And we greatly appreciate that and the technology that we're all given these days to do this. So look out for future calls, look out for future reports, and and enjoy the time you have off in August as well. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.